Today is 25th June 2024, and the noises from Moscow, the sounds coming out of Moscow, continue to be dominated by commentary, observation, and statements about the attack with an ATACMS missile on Crimea and the deaths and injuries that civilians suffered in the beach near Sevastopol. And the Russian Foreign Ministry has been particularly busy, and the US ambassador has been called in and handed in a note which the Russian Foreign Ministry are referring to as a démarche. A démarche is the most vigorous protest one government can give to another, and it contains a warning. It usually contains a warning that the relations between the two countries are on the brink of breakdown, that the actions of the country whose ambassador has been summoned are seen by the host country to have transgressed in fundamental ways, and that unless the country whose ambassador has been summoned changes its approach, then further repercussions will follow. Now, the Russian Foreign Ministry has provided us with a readout, or rather not exactly a readout, but anyway, a summary account of the meeting which took place yesterday between the Russian Foreign Ministry, the officials at the Russian Foreign Ministry, and the US ambassador. And this is what they say. Foreign Ministry summoned US ambassador to Russia, Lynn Tracy. On 24th June, US ambassador to Russia, Lynn Tracy, was summoned to the Foreign Ministry, where she was presented with a démarche in connection with a new bloody crime committed by the Kiev regime, patronized and armed by Washington, which launched a well-targeted missile attack on civilians in Sevastopol that led to numerous casualties, including among children. Now, notice that the phrase says that it was a well-targeted missile attack. In other words, the official position of the Russian government as of the moment when this démarche was presented to Ambassador Lynn Tracy, the official position of the Russian government has become that this was a deliberate attack, an intentional attack by Ukrainians upon civilians in Crimea, and that it is therefore a war crime. The press statement, if you like, the statement from the Foreign Ministry discussing this meeting between the Russian officials and the US ambassador, then goes on to say this. It was stressed that the United States was conducting a hybrid war against Russia and supplying the armed forces of Ukraine with the most advanced weapons, including ATACMS missiles with cluster warheads used against Sevastopol residents, which actually made the US a party to the conflict. So this is a sentence packed with information. Firstly, the United States is a party to the war. It is waging a hybrid war, or if you prefer, a proxy war against Russia, and Ukraine, or at least the Kiev regime, as the Russians would say, is simply a proxy in that war. And the Russians say that the United States has been supplying the most advanced weapons, including ATACMS missiles with cluster warheads, which were used against Sevastopol residents, and that this has actually made the US a party to the conflict. So the United States, in effect, is now a party to a conflict with Russia. This is now an official statement of the Russian Foreign Ministry delivered in person to the US ambassador. The Russians no longer consider themselves to be in a state of peace with the United States. Now that may evoke some scoffing remarks or comments from some people, maybe people who are watching this program, but we're talking here legal and diplomatic language. If one country says to another country formally that they're no longer in a state of peace, even if they fall short of saying that they are now in a state of war, that opens the way for all sorts of things to happen, which might not happen if the two countries were in a state of peace. And we will see how the statement from the Russian Foreign Ministry continues. Now, before I do that, however, I must make one further quick observation, which is that this statement of the Foreign Ministry carefully mentions the fact that the ATACMS missile that caused all that destruction on the beach had a cluster warhead. And as we know, because it has been officially commented upon, the Russians, both I suspect directly through their foreign ministry, but also through their news agencies, have been in contact with the relevant UN authorities, United Nations authorities, discussing whether or not this attack on the beach in Crimea might be a war crime. And the UN authorities have come back and they have said, and they said publicly, that use of cluster warheads is not in itself prohibited in times of war. There's no clear-cut prohibition that forbids the use of cluster warheads in times of war, though there is a convention in existence which seeks to outlaw them, but neither Russia nor Ukraine nor the United States are a party to it. However, the UN authorities have publicly come back and have said that as far as they are concerned, if cluster warheads are used in an attack on civilians, perhaps even if that attack is negligent as opposed to intentional, then the UN authorities would themselves consider it to be a war crime. So they're not being drawn, they're not letting themselves get drawn into an actual statement about this attack on Crimea itself, this attack on the beach in Crimea. But they are saying that if what the Russians say about it is true, then indeed it would be a war crime. Anyway, to continue. Moreover, the targeting and flight data entry is performed by US military crews, and therefore the United States shares equal responsibility with the Kiev regime for this outrage. So the Russians are now straightforwardly saying that the United States has carried out an attack which has killed Russian civilians, and that the Russians therefore consider that the United States is party to a war crime which has been committed against Russia. Anyway, the press statement concludes. The ambassador was told that Washington's actions of this sort, including its position to fire at targets in the Russian hinterland, actions that were aimed at encouraging the Kiev authorities. The press statement doesn't actually refer to the Kiev authorities. I do. They use a stronger statement, which of course takes us back to that political movement of the 1930s and 1940s, which I mention by name sparingly out of sensitivities for this platform. But anyway, actions that were aimed at encouraging the Kiev authorities to continue hostilities until the last Ukrainian would not be left unpunished. Retaliatory measures are certain to follow. Now, it's the last sentence, of course, which is the one that we should be noting, because the Russians are now straightforwardly informing the Americans that Russia will, no doubt at a time and place of its choosing, retaliate against the United States for what has just been done. Now, whenever an incident of this kind happens, I get an endless cascade of people, some well-intentioned, some I suspect not, who all tell me that President Putin is weak, that he's a chicken, that's what one person said, that he simply sits back and lets the Americans do what they like, and that he doesn't respond, something I find most strange, given that we are in effect in a war situation in Ukraine, one in which the Russians are fighting an American proxy, and winning, by the way. As I said, that seems to me completely inconsistent with the theory that Putin is any sort of coward. But anyway, putting all that aside, people always come back and they say to me, or they write to me, that the Russian reactions are not strong enough. I'm going to repeat a few observations that I made in the past, which is that it's a fundamental mistake to be pushed by the actions of your opponent into steps that might backfire on yourself. This is something, by the way, that the Americans and the Western powers have been consistently doing over the entire course of this crisis. And it has left them isolated diplomatically and globally. We saw that at the recent conference in Switzerland, only 76 countries out of 193 were prepared to sign the final communique, and that final communique was heavily watered down, one suspects, from its original, from the original drafts, and that in itself was a collapse from the 141 states in a meeting of the General Assembly back in March 2022, which had sided with the West against Russia. Global opinion is walking away. In fact, it's not just walking away. The Swiss conference demonstrated that it is increasingly siding with Russia against the United States in this crisis. Now, many people will consider this unimportant. They will say, well, how many Russian lives does this save? How does this advance Russia's position in the war? The answer is it saves many lives, and it has massively strengthened Russia's position in this war. The West has also been waging, as we know, an economic war against Russia. That economic war has failed for two reasons. One is the much greater size and power of the Russian economy as compared to what the West imagined. But the second, which is also very important, in fact, arguably at least as important, is that the rest of the world has refused to go along with this economic war, in the process willingly taking on the risk that the United States and its allies might go against them. And that fact that Russia has been able to sail through the sanctions crisis and to keep growing its economy, and in fact growing its economy directly, is therefore a direct consequence of the fact that the Russians have taken a measured and wise approach to these endless challenges and provocations that they receive from the West. And it has, by doing so, through preserving the Russian economy, through avoiding an economic crisis in Russia, it has sustained production at its current levels, and that, of course, is having a direct impact on the battlefield, as we will soon see. Anyway, this constant harping about the Russians needing to do something, well, it's never made clear to me what exactly it is that they should do in response to provocations of this kind. This constant harping, to my mind, goes against the fundamental principle of what one should do when faced by provocations of this kind. There are all kinds of famous phrases that people quote when they find in these kind of circumstances. Don't get mad, get even is one. Revenge is a dish to be eaten cold is another. I'm sure you can come up with others. I think that the Putin government has weighed this situation about right, but it doesn't mean that they can simply sit back and are intending to sit back and are going to let the West simply ride right over them. Already, they've taken the strong action that I've discussed. They began the special military operation, which has had a massive effect on the West, especially in Europe. Economically, it's drained Western military resources in a way that no one in the West ever imagined. And just as they said they would when the idea of launching missile strikes deep inside Russia, missile strikes into the Russian hinterland, as the Foreign Ministry describes it. Well, just as they warned in the event that such a thing would happen, they are now promising retaliation. And they say that those who acted would not be left unpunished, and retaliatory measures are certain to follow. Now, on the question of punishment, I'm not going to be taken at its face. Those words might imply that the Russians might come after personally the individuals within the US government who they believe were party to these decisions. And the Kremlin, by the way, has issued a statement in which they say that they know perfectly well who was behind the decisions of this kind. I don't want to investigate or explore that because, frankly, this whole issue of taking personal steps against individuals makes me profoundly uncomfortable. All I would say is that this certainly goes beyond any token threat to sanction individuals. But consider the next sentence. Retaliatory measures are certain to follow. And I think we don't have to explore what those retaliatory measures mean. What they mean is that the Russians are going to start supplying sophisticated weapons to enemies and adversaries of the United States. They've already all but said they would do this with respect to North Korea. We saw those words that President Putin made in his press conference in Vietnam, and it is, I think, a certainty that the Russians will be providing weapon systems, advanced weapon systems, to other American adversaries as well. The Russians, apparently, are on the brink of agreeing another strategic partnership, this time with Iran, another country with which the United States is on very bad terms. That strategic partnership, if it follows the lines of the one that the Russians have just concluded with North Korea, is certain to have a military dimension. The Iranian military already appears to be a formidable force, at least by Middle Eastern standards. If they start getting supplied with advanced weapons from Russia, they will become a more formidable force still. At the very least, that will have an impact on the balance of power in the Middle East. It will limit the United States' room for maneuver in the Middle East. But of course, it might well go beyond that, because weapon systems that are supplied by the Russians to the Iranians and technology that the Russians supply to the Iranians could quite easily find their way. In fact, they are absolutely guaranteed to find their way to all sorts of other adversaries of the United States in the Middle East, of which there are any number. We have the Houthis in Yemen, who continue to sink Western cargo ships in the Red Sea. I've just seen a report that a Greek-registered cargo ship has just sunk after a Houthi attack. There are rumours, and I think these are only rumours, that the Houthis also managed to hit and do presumably only superficial damage to one of the US Navy carriers, the Eisenhower. I'm far from convinced, by the way, of the truth of this story, and I'm not going to explore it more deeply in this program. But of course, the Houthis have been conducting these strikes against these ships in the Red Sea with relatively unsophisticated weapons, at least unsophisticated by the standards of the US and Russia. What the Houthis might do if they were provided with more advanced weapons, the kind of weapons the Russians might supply, and perhaps satellite data, I don't even want to try to guess. Suffice to say that whilst the Russians, as I have repeatedly pointed out, have demonstrated repeatedly an ability to intercept and shoot down US ATACMS missiles, the Ukrainians, equipped with the most advanced, well, allegedly some of the most advanced US air defense systems, have confirmed themselves that they have no ability to shoot down Russian Iskander-M ballistic missiles. So there we are. That's just one possibility. But of course, there could be many others. Right across the Middle East, as I said, there are all sorts of parties who would be only too delighted to attack American bases and installations, which are scattered all over the Middle East. And if they are provided with military support, weaponry, equipment, training, intelligence data from the Russians, well, they will become an exponentially more dangerous force than they already are. And we are almost certainly close to that point. The Russians, as I said, have already said that they are thinking of doing this. But let's go back to those words that they used, that the United States is conducting a hybrid war against Russia and is a party to the conflict. So, the Russians, as I said, no longer consider themselves to be in a state of peace with the United States. It's not outright war, and let us pray that never comes, but it is not peace either. And as I said, when two countries are no longer at peace with each other, all sorts of alarming and frightening things become possible, and the Russians waging proxy wars against the Americans across the Middle East, targeting Americans, that has now become not just a possibility, but I would say, after these Russian comments, effectively a certainty. And to be clear, almost certainly the price is going to be paid in American lives. Now, a couple of years ago, during a certain election, which I'm not going to talk about in this program, an allegation was floating around that the Russians were offering bonuses to the Taliban fighters in Afghanistan to kill Americans. That story was untrue. As I remember, it created uproar in the United States. We must now prepare ourselves for the possibility that at some point over the next few years, the Russians are going to start doing exactly that. Now, of course, the US is in a position to retaliate. It might start taking action against the Russians in all sorts of places. But the United States is a global power. It has a presence everywhere in the world, which is, of course, a source of tremendous strength, but it is also a source of great vulnerability. Russia, a more confined power, situated in the Eurasian continent, trading now principally with allies with which it either shares coasts or borders. And bear in mind that the Russians are now in the process of building railway lines to Iran, one of them apparently almost completed, and are looking to establish land corridors to India as well. They've just, by the way, done a whole succession of deals with Afghanistan. It looks as if that famous project of setting up oil pipelines from Central Asia southwards to India, oil and gas pipelines, is about to be realized, but it will be realized by the Russians, not by the Americans, as was being talked about in the early 2000s, and it will be done in order to facilitate direct trade between Russia and India, assuming, of course, that one day happens. And, well, it might indeed happen. I said earlier in this program that the Russians have managed to get most of global opinion swinging behind them over this crisis. And lo and behold, who is now coming to visit Moscow? Prime Minister Modi of India. He's going to be arriving in Russia on the 9th of July. It could be, it probably will be, Modi's first foreign trip since he was re-elected Prime Minister of India, and it looks like he's coming to Moscow to consolidate the relationship, perhaps agree these trade connections that I've just been talking about, and deepen the strategic partnership between India and Russia. And all of this, of course, without taking account the fact that India and Russia also have business to discuss with each other with respect to the BRICS and the ideas about creating a global financial and trading architecture as well. So, to repeat again, if there is going to be an all-out war with the Americans and the Russians hunting each other across the world, yes, the Russians will take losses, but it is the United States ultimately which is more vulnerable. And again, that is something which, as far as I can see, Americans, or at least the American leadership, doesn't seem to have taken into account. And by the way, the same applies to the European allies of the United States. Now, let me make it absolutely clear. I am horrified by these developments. I do not welcome the fact that we're going to be in a situation even more dangerous than the one which existed in the Cold War, when there were at least rules between the Russians and the Americans, so that the kind of all-out covert struggle that we're likely to see play out now, well, that never happened on anything like that, this scale that we're likely to see, and it's unlikely to get so far out of control. I find this absolutely horrifying. I have no idea where, if taken to its ultimate point, this is going to lead us, but this is the consequence of the unending escalation that the West, the United States, first and foremost, has been conducting in Ukraine. So a very ominous, very concerning meeting between the American ambassador and the Russian foreign ministry. And of course it follows just a few weeks after the British and French ambassadors were called into the foreign ministry and were given similar warnings. The Western media is choosing to ignore these warnings from Moscow. I think that this is reckless and unwise, to say the least. We are, as I said, in a deteriorating situation. And I think people in the West, and in this I include governments, do not understand how fast deteriorating this situation is becoming and how dangerous it is becoming as well. Now, the Russian Foreign Ministry has not just released its account of the meeting with the American ambassador. They've actually released a fairly lengthy statement about the attack on the beach near Sevastopol. And again, I said fairly lengthy. I'm going to read it nonetheless. They say that on June 23rd, the Kiev regime, with the support of the United States and its satellites, i.e. the Europeans, committed yet another heinous terrorist crime against civilians in Russia by firing missiles at Sevastopol. For their terrorist attack, they specifically chose a day, Holy Trinity Sunday, Pentecost, by the way, in the Western Christian calendar, obviously celebrated on different days, but this is in the Orthodox world. This is the Feast of Pentecost, one of the most important holidays celebrated by the Russian Orthodox Church. 4 persons were killed, including a 2-year-old boy who was playing on the municipal beach and a 9-year-old girl. 151 people applied for medical assistance, 82 persons, 55 adults and 27 children were hospitalized, many of them in a grave condition, which tells us that the death toll is going to rise. All patients are receiving skilled medical aid. According to the Defense Ministry of Russia, the attackers used US ATACMS operational missiles with cluster warheads for greater kill ability. All flight data were entered by US military crews based on US reconnaissance satellite inputs. A Global Hawk US reconnaissance drone was on duty off Crimea. The Investigative Committee of Russia has promptly started an investigation into this crime. All those implicated in this and other terrorist attacks in the territory of the Russian Federation will incur inevitable punishment. So here again, we're basically being told that the Russians have an idea who the people behind this were and that they will track them down. Now, again, I don't want to discuss that further because doing so makes me feel very uncomfortable. And then the Foreign Ministry statement says, there is no doubt that the United States is involved in this ominous crime. Washington and its satellites have created and nurtured the regime in Kiev. They are cherishing and supporting their Ukrainian puppets, using them to wage a war against Russia and encouraging them to commit acts of international terrorism and kill Russian civilians, including with the use of cluster munitions, one of the most terrible types of inhumane weapons. A response to this crime will inevitably follow. And they say the statement finishes with another demand that the Western powers finally start distancing themselves from what they say are the actions of the Kiev regime, and also the Foreign Ministry itself extends its sympathies to the families of the people who were caught up in this attack. So there we are. This is what the Russians are saying. As I said, I think people are being complacent, and sometimes I have to say in their criticism, facile. I think this is a most concerning situation. The fact that the Russians are responding carefully and are choosing their words carefully and are acting in a measured way does not mean that they're not going to respond. It only means that the response, when it comes, is going to be more effective and more powerful and perhaps more unexpected than it otherwise would be. Well, this is as much as I'm going to say about this incident for the moment. I have no doubt that over the next few weeks and months, things are going to start to play themselves out. We probably won't recognize the traces immediately, but as things start to build up around the world, at some point perhaps we will. And then, of course, when we do, we will be in a different situation completely, and then we will see. But anyway, this is where we stand at the moment. Russia, America, no longer at peace with each other, not yet formally in a state of war, but definitely in conflict to an extent that they never were during the Cold War itself. Now, lots of other things are happening in the diplomatic front, and I'm going to turn to them shortly. But before I do that, I think this is perhaps a good moment to turn to the events on the battlefronts. And one of the great paradoxes about this attack on the beach, about all of this American military support for Ukraine, about all of these things, is that, of course, it is not going to change or alter in any way what is actually happening on the battlefronts. This is what makes the whole thing so exasperating. The United States taking more and more reckless risks, searching constantly for ways to injure the Russians and to throw the Russians back and to force them into some kind of disadvantageous negotiated peace, which would really be, in effect, a capitulation. The United States trying to do all of this, even as its actions simply cause a global deterioration in the overall situation, but do not change the events and the outcomes on the battlefield in Ukraine. Now, we have had a most extraordinary series of events in Ukraine over the last couple of hours. Because yesterday, I think it was yesterday, but a few hours ago, one of the leaders of the Azov Brigade, what I saw The Guardian referred to as Ukraine's revered Azov Brigade, I find it astonishing that The Guardian, of all newspapers, should be using a word like revered to refer to the Azov Brigade. But again, I'm going to let that pass. Anyway, one of the leaders of the Azov Brigade issued a scorching commentary about a senior Ukrainian general who he did not name. He said that this general was incompetent and inefficient and had caused the deaths of more Ukrainian soldiers than any Russian soldier had done. It's now largely acknowledged that the general that he was referring to was a general called General Sodol. Now, I am not sure exactly what rank General Sodol has. There's been suggestions that he commanded the Ukrainian forces in the Kupiansk sector, which is where the 3rd Azov Brigade, the Azov Brigade, is currently located, or at least so I have heard. But there are other reports which seem to suggest that General Sodol's responsibilities extended beyond any particular sector, and that he was perhaps the area commander for the entire battle in Donbass. I am not going to pretend that I know the truth of this one way or another. Anyway, the Azov Brigade, because clearly this is a collective decision of theirs, came out and criticised this general, and within a few hours, President Zelensky had sacked him. and has replaced him, by the way, with another general of whom I know absolutely nothing, except that apparently he was involved in the fighting in southern Ukraine, in Kherson region, in the autumn of 2022, a brutal and bloody campaign in which the Ukrainians suffered appalling losses to achieve ephemeral gains that they have not been able to capitalize on. But anyway, he has now been appointed, this general has now been appointed to take Sodol's place. Now, there are two possible explanations for this incident. Possibility one is that the Azov Brigade, the people in the Azov Brigade, were put up to do this by Zelensky himself and by members of his entourage. There are rumours circulating that Zelensky is becoming deeply frustrated and angry with his generals, that he is aware of the growing deterioration of the situation on the battlefronts, that though he doesn't regret the dismissal of General Zaluzhny, he now regrets the appointment of General Syrsky and is looking to isolate General Syrsky and to sack him as well. And that it might have been, therefore, Zelensky, who is the ultimate person, who arranged through the Azov Brigade for General Sodol's dismissal. Of course, there is an entirely different possibility, which is that the Azov Brigade has acted entirely on its own initiative, that they have some kind of quarrel with General Sodol, whose orders they might not like. Perhaps they don't consider him fully reliable. There are suggestions that General Sodol was in fact close to General Syrsky, and it's widely assumed that the Azov Brigade doesn't actually care very much for General Syrsky, who, apart from all his other faults and transgressions, real and imagined, happens to be Russian. So it could be that the Azov Brigade, or that the Azov Brigade complained about General Sodol of their own initiative by themselves. In which case, Zelensky sacked Sodol, not because he wanted to or chose to, but because the Azov Brigade publicly insisted on it. Either way, President Zelensky looks very weak. It looks as if he's unable to make command decisions effectively. Either he has to rely through proxies to criticize generals before he sacks them, in which case he put up the Azov Brigade to do it, or he is basically doing what the Azov Brigade tells him to do. Now, President Putin of Russia and the Russians in general have been harping on the fact that since President Zelensky chose to retain office, despite signing off on a martial law, after signing off on a martial law decree, that he's no real legal basis to remain in office, no constitutional basis to remain in office, that he's a usurper, in other words. Anyway, ever since the Russians have said that, one has got the sense increasingly that Zelensky is indeed living on borrowed time. And there's been all of these articles that have appeared in the Western media that also suggest that the Americans are becoming increasingly exasperated with him. And the Russians are circulating now, and it isn't just Putin, but several other Russians are now circulating stories that the Americans are planning to sack Zelensky sometime in the new year, after the November elections are out of the way, and presumably after the inauguration of the president at the end of the US president at the end of January. So perhaps all of this is having an effect. Perhaps people are starting to question whether Zelensky really has the right to exercise control. And of course, beyond that, we've had any number of reports which suggest that Zelensky's relations, both with the military and with the, shall we call them the nationalist brigades in the Ukrainian military, which had previously been strongly aligned with General Zelensky, that his relations with these units have been precarious, to say the least. Whatever the facts, whatever the truth about General Sodor, whether he really was incompetent, whether he really did make mistakes, whether he was all the things that we are told about him, whatever the facts, it seems to me that Zelensky comes out of this episode looking weak. It has highlighted the extent of his fragility. And we come back again to that conference in Switzerland that took place just a week ago. The fact that ultimately only a relatively small number of countries were prepared to sign the communiqué, that most world leaders, or at least outside Europe, chose to stay away. The fact that this is now recognized widely to have been President Zelensky's peace summit. I suspect that the effect of its failure has further undermined his position in Ukraine and has led us to this result, which we now see. Anyway, this would only be happening if the war was going badly, and all the evidence continues to be that it continues to go very badly. Now, the big news story that was circulating yesterday all over the various Telegram channels and blog pieces and messaging boards of the various military units, the Russian Defense Ministry, all sorts of bloggers and people like war reporters and people like that, was the growing use by the Russians of FAB-3000 bombs. Now, the Russians started using FAB-3000s about a week ago, but with every day that passes, the number of these bombs that are being dropped is increasing. So far, all of the FAB-3000 bombs that have been dropped appear to have been dropped in Kharkiv region, but it's probably only a question of time before we start to see them being dropped in other places as well. And the number of bombs is steadily increasing. We're talking about now certainly more than one a day, perhaps two or three a day, but one gets the sense that the Russians are becoming increasingly confident in the use of these bombs. Now, there is here something that I need to correct, which I've had great assistance from a number of members of the Duran community, people who are very familiar with bombs, technology, and weapon systems, and all of these things. Now, repeating what I have been reading in various Telegram channels and heard on the Military Summary channel, I've gone along with the view that the accuracy of these FAB-3000s has not been pinpoint as it has been with some of the other bombs that have been used, the FAB-500s and FAB-1500s, for example. And the reason for that is that instead of dropping directly upon buildings, most of these bombs have been dropped just next to buildings. Well, I stand corrected. And on this, I've had so much help from a variety of sources, all people who are technically expert in this area, that I have no doubt that this is correct. The point that's being made is that the sheer scale of these bombs means that in order to maximize the blast effect, you do not actually necessarily want them to land on a building itself. You want to drop the bomb in the midst of a group of buildings. The blast from a bomb of this size would be tremendous. It would almost certainly kill or severely wound anybody in any neighboring building, or, by the way, group of buildings. So that if, for example, you have a cluster of high-rise buildings and you are aware that there are Ukrainian troops stationed inside them, well, you wouldn't want to drop a FAB-3000 on each individual building. If there was a small space between these high rises, you drop it on that space. The blast effect would be tremendous, and with one bomb, you would cause terrible casualties amongst all the troops located not just in one of these buildings, but in several others. So that is why several of these bombs have appeared not to fall directly on the buildings that they're targeting. It is a product of the special characteristics of these simply enormous bombs, which the Russians are using tactically on a scale that no other air force does, because no other air force has in quantity precision-guided heavy bombs like this. And in fact, I noticed that over the last couple of hours, some of the platforms that have spread the story about the inaccuracy, the lack of pinpoint precision of some of these bombs have started to pull back and have started to accept that the accuracy of these bombs is indeed every bit as high as is that of all of the other FAB bombs that the Russians are now deploying on the battlefronts. In fact, it is remarkable how rapidly the Russians have adapted themselves to the use of these bombs in the Kharkiv region, that even though, as I said, the fact that we are still getting the use of these bombs on a relatively low scale, in the sense that only 2 or 3 are dropped on any one day, well, that suggests that they're still in relatively short supply, though, as many people are pointing out, in most situations, if you wanted to drop a bomb, you would not drop a FAB-3000 bomb. FAB-500s or FAB-1500s, or indeed FAB-250s, lighter bombs, would actually be more effective than these enormously heavy bombs in most situations in which bombing takes place. So, there we go. I would add that the fact that we are seeing more of these bombs being dropped gradually, day by day, that the number is increasing, that suggests to me that there are more than 2 Sukhoi 34s dropping them. The big thing that might eventually happen, but that will depend very much on the state of Ukraine's air defences. The big event that might be, well, perhaps not so far off on the time horizon, is if the Russians deploy their big Tupolev 22M3 medium bombers with these bombs. At the moment, I think these very large bombers operating close to the contact line would be extremely vulnerable to Ukrainian air defences if they attempted to launch these big area bombs against the Ukrainians. But who knows, perhaps in a few months the situation will change, and then of course aircraft of that size, which to be clear are still short of being strategic bombers. We're not talking about, really big aircraft like the Tupolev 160 and the Tupolev 95, But anyway, it could be that these Tupolev 22M3s might eventually start to appear along the contact line, dropping these bombs in sizable clusters. And then, of course, the results are likely to be dramatic. They would be dramatic, for example, in areas like the high-rise building area in Volchansk, and they would be dramatic in other places. And the primary target, as the Russians have said, is Ukrainian infrastructure and fortifications, and that is what they are clearly being used against. Now, the Russians have been bombing Ukrainian positions right across the contact line very, very heavily over the last 24 hours as they advance, as they push forward all along the front lines. And the story, the big story, the one that's catching all of the attention at the moment, is what is happening in Toretsk, which perhaps is the central area of this potential cauldron that the Russians might be forming in the area from Pokrovsk in the west to Chasiv Yar and Konstantinovka in the east. And it's clear that the Ukrainians were taken by surprise by the Russian attack on Toretsk, and there are reports that the Russians continue to gain ground in Toretsk. And earlier today, the Ukrainian authorities announced that they are evacuating the civilian population from Toretsk, which looks like it's now about to become a contested city in the same way that Bakhmut, Avdiivka, Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, Mariupol have been. So the battle for Toretsk, it seems, is about to start in earnest. Now, there was a major discussion of this battle in the Russian newspaper Redovka. Redovka writes very interesting pieces. They are normally accurate, but they're not 100% accurate. I should say that is my own subjective opinion about them. But anyway, Redovka was saying that the fundamental problem the Ukrainians have in the Toretsk area, and perhaps this is what ultimately led to the summary dismissal of General Sodol, is that there just aren't enough troops in Toretsk and in the surrounding area, Ukrainian troops in this area, to defend the big fortified positions that have been created effectively. And the reason is that because of their critical manpower crisis, the Ukrainians have been forced to deploy all their available troops to various parts of the front lines, and that because the area around Toretsk had been quiet for so long, they discounted the possibility that the Russians would attack there. They became fairly complacent that there would not be a Russian attack in this area, in part because the fortifications seemed so strong, so that they withdrew large numbers of troops from Toretsk, leaving the city short of troops to defend it and short of troops to man all the fortifications. And Redovka engages in an interesting discussion about whether the Ukrainians are going to now transfer reserves to try to hold a position in Toretsk, which might mean stripping other parts of the front lines of troops, or whether instead they're going to retreat further, deeper into Toretsk, trying to build up their defences where the density of the Ukrainian soldiers starts to become greater. It's an interesting account. I'm not going to try to second guess it and to say whether it's right or wrong. What I will say is that if it is right, well, here you get another example of the effect of the Russians' anaconda strategy of maintaining aggressive attrition all across the front lines, keeping up the pressure everywhere all the time, forcing the Ukrainians to reshuffle brigades from one place to the next, exhausting the men, exposing the units that have been reshuffled to Russian missile and bomb strikes as they move along the railways and the main roads, which must be disastrous for their morale as well as for their unit cohesion and their ability to enter battle, exhausting the Ukrainians in that way, and in effect, in every sense, grinding them down. Now, that's Toretsk. Russians making progress there. We will see how far it goes. In the Kharkiv region, the last couple of hours, as far as I can tell, have been essentially quiet. The Russians continue to claim that they've been making more and more advances, and gaining more ground in Volchansk. They say that they have advanced by 150 meters over the last 24 hours in Volchansk. Again, I'm not exactly certain where, but I presume it's in the area to the southwest of the aggregate plant. The Russians haven't yet said that they are in full control of the aggregate plant, but more likely than not, they are. The Ukrainians continue their efforts to break through Russian positions in eastern Volchansk to try to rescue their men in the high-rise buildings, the citadel area. But so far, it doesn't look as if they're having much success. The Russians continue to bomb and shell the citadel area relentlessly. The condition of Ukrainian troops in this area must be terrible. And of course, if at some point the Russians start unleashing FAB-3000 bombs on the citadel area, the area of the high-rise buildings, well, I'm not going to try to imagine what the effect of that would be. It might be enough in itself to cause resistance to collapse. I don't know. Anyway, there are reports starting to circulate that Ukrainian losses have been so high in the Kharkiv area, and by the way, in the Chasiv Yar area also, that Ukrainian units are now once more increasingly refusing orders to go on the attack. Again, this might be one of the contributory factors to the dismissal of General Sordor. At one point, as I well remember, the Azov Brigade was itself refusing orders to attack, and it could be that General Sordor, at the urging of his commander, General Syrskyi, was issuing such orders, and that this was leading to terrible Ukrainian losses, and that it was this which caused the story to spread that he was killing more Ukrainians than any Russian general had done. Well, it could be that this is what is happening in Volchansk, and it seems that it might also be happening in Chasiv Yar. There are reports that the Russians have now started an operation in the buildings, the remaining buildings in the western part of the micro-district east of the canal, or rather of the aqueduct, that the Russians are now starting to clear the Ukrainians from their positions in the remaining high-rise buildings. It may be that this is the case. If Ukrainian troops in this area are refusing to go on to the attack, as some are saying, then I'm going to make a guess that it is that they are refusing orders to advance along the so-called Road of Death from central Chasiv Yar to relieve and reinforce the men in the micro district, because the Russians have tight fire control over this road. They are located both to the north and to the south of it, and frankly, for Ukrainian troops to try and advance along this road would amount, for many of them, in effect to an act of suicide. So anyway, that's as best as I know it, the situation in Chasiv Yar. There are also reports that in the Siversk area, the Russians might be on the brink of capturing the village of Razdolovka, which apparently is one of a string of villages from Siversk, and which in effect means that the Russians would have entered a built-up area and can advance through these villages right up into the centre of Siversk, which might be indeed ultimately their plan. I don't know. And there's also lots of reports that the Russians are planning some kind of major operation in the Kupiansk area, that they're launching attacks from Sinkovka now again. They haven't heard much about fighting in that area for a long time, but supposedly it's resumed. And in the Ocheretino-Avdeevka area, well, I've already discussed that the Russians seem to be making strong moves towards cutting the road, the supply road, from Pokrovsk to Chasiv Yar. And in this brief summary, let me also say that, again, we are hearing lots of reports now, both from the Russians and from the Ukrainians, that the Russians are now close to completing the clearing of Krasnogorovka, town of about 14,000 people, located close to Donetsk city. I've heard this claim several times before, but I'm hearing that this time it's for real. The Ukrainians have been pushed out of all the potential fortified positions in Krasnogorovka. All that they now control are basically small wooden buildings which are not sufficient to withstand Russian advances, and that the Russians therefore are likely to start clearing Krasnogorovka before long. Well, the Russians have, by the way, been discussing also some of their tactics recently. The Russian Defense Ministry spoke about the increasing use of motorcycle troops mounted on motorcycles to storm Ukrainian positions. They pointed out that the speed of the cross-country motorcycles makes it almost impossible for the Ukrainians to strike at these troops as they move across country with FPV drones, and apparently they make a difficult moving target even for machine guns and rifles. And the Russian Defense Ministry cited several occasions when, through the use of motorcycles, motorcycle-borne infantry was able to storm and capture various Ukrainian positions. And indeed, we are seeing increasingly the use of motorcycles in that kind of way right across the contact line. It seems an astonishing thing that at one and the same time, we have the Russians using FAB-3000 bombs, these enormous bombs, precision-guided, presumably using some form of GLONASS targeting, in other words, a sophisticated weapon, and at the same time, they're advancing in other places on motorcycles. It gives one a sense of the extraordinary quality of the war, the way in which the highest technology gets combined sometimes with fairly basic tools, but does so in what is in effect a winning combination. Anyway, there we are. Now, I'm going to conclude this program with two quick further points, both on diplomatic questions. Firstly, we've had a fairly lengthy discussion of the overall state of the conflict and of Putin's ideas from his foreign policy, his chief foreign policy aide, Yuri Ushakov. Now, Ushakov has been talking about the Kremlin's thinking and about where they think the conflict is going. And he's somebody that ultimately is exceptionally well informed, since, as I understand it, he meets with Putin practically every day. And the thing that came across to me from his comments, which took place at the Primakov Readings Forum, is that the Russians have increasingly come round to the view that there is not going to be a long-term security system in Europe and no real resolution of the conflict in Ukraine unless there is finally that major reshaping of the Eurasian security architecture that Putin increasingly is talking about. In fact, he is reported as having said that the unified and indivisible security system in Eurasia must replace the Euro-Atlantic and Eurocentric models receding into oblivion. Now, one of the most interesting things that I have received in terms of emails recently was one which was from the historian Jeff Roberts, which pointed out to me that way back in 1954, the then Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, close associate and political ally of Joseph Stalin, and the man who, of course, negotiated the notorious Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and who participated to an extraordinary degree in the diplomacy of the Second World War period. Anyway, he was again Soviet Foreign Minister in 1954. And he proposed in 1954 something that is not widely known, that the Soviet Union itself should apply for membership of NATO, of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now that seems bizarre by the standards of today. But the point was that Molotov, who was perfectly well aware that there might be propaganda advantages for the Soviet Union if they made this application to join NATO and it was refused. He also thought, however, that the Soviet Union joining NATO would in fact be a breakthrough in achieving a genuine establishment of a stable, inclusive security structure in Europe, except, of course, that it would not only be in Europe. What Molotov was thinking about is that NATO continues, but it's in some ways neutralized by the Soviet Union itself joining it. The United States, however, would remain a participant, and there would then be a larger framework of European security, which would involve the United States, but also China. Now, this was in 1954, just 5 years after the People's Republic of China had been established. Now, it is one of the facts that isn't widely known about the Cold War, which is that the Soviets were repeatedly, throughout the Cold War, looking to achieve some kind of stable security situation in Europe. Firstly, they were, for a long time, they were seeking a peace treaty, a formal peace treaty, along the lines of Vienna and Versailles, bringing together the victors and losers of the Second World War. Then when that didn't happen, they moved forward to try to set up the Helsinki Conference, which did in the end produce the Helsinki Final Act. Anyway, one way or the other, the Russians always sought a security agreement in Europe. And it seems that they again are. And it's strange to see how similar it is, what they're seeking now, to what they sought all those decades ago at the beginning of the Cold War, back in 1954. Truly, what goes round comes round. We're back to that again. However, of course, today the world is very different from what it was in 1954. In 1954, the Soviet Union was, of course, a very powerful country. It was a military and industrial superpower, but of course the United States was far more powerful, and the allies of the United States meant that the combined West, the collective West, an expression nobody used at that time, was more powerful still. China was an impoverished agricultural country that had only just emerged after decades of conflict and war, and which, by the way, within a few years was going to experience further instability in the form of the economic crisis, if you wish, of the Great Leap Forward, and then, of course, of the Cultural Revolution. So that was then. Today, things are completely different. The Soviet Union has gone, but Russia has taken its place. It is becoming increasingly stronger and more assertive. And China today is a country which, in economic terms, has in fact surpassed, certainly in manufacturing and industrial terms, has surpassed the United States itself, and which, as the British magazine, The Economist, now informs us, has surpassed, or may be about to surpass, the United States also in fundamental science. So the world is completely different. And whilst the Western powers could reject Soviet proposals like Molotov's made in 1954, one gets the sense that this time the Russians believe that they are going to be able to make it work. It might take time to be accepted, but they think that things are starting to move in their direction. And to repeat again, Ushakov's words, the unified and indivisible security system in Europe must replace the Euro-Atlantic and Eurocentric models receding into oblivion. So that's one thing. Now, the Chinese, for their part, have acted very angrily to these attempts made in the West to make out that they're somehow upset and angry about Russia's rapprochement with China. And there's been an article about this in Global Times, and it reads, US condemned for attempting to sow discord between China, Russia, and North Korea. And we read that experts have rebuked the US for trying to sow discord between China and Russia and North Korea, noting that the closer relationship between the two Chinese neighbours is based on current realities, as their mutual support can break through Western blockades. And the Chinese have taken particular umbrage to certain comments by General Brown, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who is reported to have told our reporters on Sunday during an overseas trip that the newly signed strategic partnership agreement between Russia and North Korea would create friction with China. And Reuters then on Wednesday, went on to say that anonymous analysts claimed that the Russian moves with North Korea could undercut Beijing's leverage over its two neighbours, and any heightened instability could be negative for China's global economic and strategic position. And then Global Times quotes a Chinese expert, Liu Chao. In fact, China is pleased to see the strengthening of friendly cooperation between these two neighbouring countries. The mutually supportive ties between Russia and North Korea are expected to contribute to regional security and peace and stability in Northeast Asia. China's relations with both Russia and North Korea share a common goal of maintaining peace and stability in Northeast Asia, and their comprehensive cooperation is reasonable. And we then go on to read that the closer relationship between North Korea and Russia is based on current realities. Both Russia and North Korea face severe pressure from the United States-led Western clique. In this situation, it is natural for the two countries to come together, especially since they have mutually beneficial aspects, such as Russia's assistance in energy and food supplies to North Korea. And the idea that the Chinese are unhappy about all of this, as I said, is strongly debunked. We always believed that upholding peace and stability in the Korean Peninsula and advancing the political settlement of the peninsula issue serves the common interests of all parties, and hope various parties will make constructive efforts to this end. And I have no doubt at all that this is true. Westerners continue to get this whole issue of the relationship between China and Russia, and between Russia and North Korea, and between China and North Korea. They continue to get it all wrong. Well, there we are. That's where I'm going to finish the program today. Very strong warnings from the Russians to the Americans. A situation of confrontation between these two great powers, which is going to be more hostile than the one we saw during the Cold War, and more kinetic as well. There are, I suspect, no rules in this relationship at the moment, no guardrails. More likely than not, if and when this crisis abates, the two sides, faced with all the problems that this situation causes, and one would like to believe primarily the more vulnerable party, which in this scenario actually is the United States, they will come together and try to untangle this mess and come to at least some preliminary understandings with each other. In the meantime, the world has largely made up its own mind about the Ukrainian conflict, and it has made up its mind in ways that are not favourable to the West. And as for the situation on the ground, it continues to evolve in Russia's favour, even as the Russians press forward with the links that they forged with China, North Korea, Vietnam, and before long, Iran as well. Well, this is where I finish my programme for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programmes on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget that you can also check out our shop. There's still, I believe, the Football 24 promotion underway. And last but not least, if you've liked this programme, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.